Hey, what's up guys? Little man with a big opinion here. So today's video I am showing you what my weekend project was. And hopefully we will be able to continue to make this a weekend project. And I'll give y'all updates as I go through the weekends. Um, I won't be able to do it every single weekend out of the year, but sometimes we might do it during the week just to, keep up with it. But I've made it a goal for 2026 to add 30 days worth of food, specifically coming from my freeze dryer. So this past weekend, I took some SpaghettiOs. Obviously, this is the Walmart brand, and I converted it into a Mountain House meal. Um, you know, I own Mountain House meals. I've got, 3 or 4 weeks worth of, actually packaged Mountain House meals. But, they go, on sale. They're about $10 a piece. And right now they're about $11, $12 meals. I guess depending on where you live, they might be a little bit more. And, you're packing in somewhere between 400 and 500 calories a meal. So we've had a freeze dryer for years. We bought it to make freeze dried candy. And, I planned on making, backpacking, camping style meals. But I can also use this for, my preps. So I'm going to break down the cost of, what went into it. I took some videos that I turned into shorts on what I did throughout the process and just explaining why I did, specifically this and how it's going to, you know, pay for the machine itself, peace of mind, all that sort of stuff. So I started out with 12 cans of SpaghettiOs. They're 15-ounce cans. They were $1.08 a can. Um, don't pay any taxes on this where I live, which I didn't really look up other states. I just know in Texas, food you don't pay taxes on, unless it's like junk food kind of stuff. If you go to the gas station and get a Monster, you're gonna pay taxes on it. But you can freeze dry basically anything that you want to freeze dry. The few exceptions are stuff that are like highly processed with certain ingredients. It doesn't freeze dry very well. And I specifically went with SpaghettiOs because this reminds me of, my childhood. I can remember, my mom making SpaghettiOs, giving me and my brother a bowl, and we ate it before the second can heated up in the microwave, and she would give us that, and then she would eat the third can. But it's a comfort meal. Uh, Loads of carbs. I was actually fairly impressed with the amount of protein in one of these. If you're trying to build muscle, chicken is really good for that roughly 100 calories for 10 grams of protein. This is right at about half, which isn't terrible. Uh, you can get the SpaghettiOs without the meatballs, and then the protein basically disappears. And it's fairly high in sodium, which I would consider that a good thing for a prepping food or a backpacking food because it's going to help you, retain more water. So it's a decent meal to freeze dry. On a separate note, if you wanted to make your own from scratch or make SpaghettiO, or spaghetti, you can do that as well. This is the simplest form of, taking this food, which, in this can, they're saying it's good till October 2027. So getting about a year and a half shelf life. Plus, pushing that another 6 months to a year. Some argue you can go, 3 to 5 years. It's really, inspecting the can, uh, for any damage or rust. And so this by itself is a good prep. You can set it aside. Uh, and it's already fully cooked. Like I said, I started out with 12 cans. We have a medium freeze dryer, and we used 10.5 cans. So the other half, I spooned some out for my son, and I ate, the last, quarter, third of a can, just straight from the can. So in that way, it is kind of similar to an MRE. Uh, but, this is 15 ounces of weight, plus you add the weight of the can. This makes it much lighter. It pulls out 99.9% of the water. Um, and, the science behind freeze drying your food says if done properly, you're going to get 25 plus years out of it. I remember reading something somewhere that Mountain House, for FDA rules, they couldn't just say this is going to last forever. The package is going to fail before the food goes bad. So every 10 to 15 years, Mountain House increases, their best by date by about 5 years because they've had to go through more testing to physically prove that it lasts that long. So I've got this dated, I did it this weekend. We've got 3/29/26, and I just wrote Spagos. There's a 500cc oxygen absorber in here. The bags that I went for, I got a variety pack. I've got all the way down to a pint, up to 1 gallon bags, and there's a decent amount of space in here. Definitely could have put a bit more food in here, but it is roughly 1 can's worth. Because on some of these, I'm gonna pull the nutritional facts off of this can, and tape them, at least to the container that I put them in, or to one or two of the packages. I've got a pretty nice flat surface here. But so the cost. I mentioned a regular Mountain House meal, $10 to $15. This can is $1.08. These are 9.5 mil food grade Mylar bags. Little bit more expensive getting ones with a Ziploc on it. But the specific ones that I went for, they're 27 cents, for bag and oxygen absorber. It was 100 pack. I showed it in a video a little while ago. So, if you're saying 27 cents for a quart size bag, also a 1 gallon bag, also a pint size bag, there's a little bit of a shift, by a few pennies there. The more that you buy, there were some that got down to about 20 cents. There were some that went up to about 35 cents. I think buying 100 bags at a time is a nice sweet spot. Because the batch that I ran, we got 8 quart-sized bags out of it. So, a little bit more than 1 can's worth. I'm just going to slightly round up, the calories on the can, say 390. I'm just going to make it an even 400. I know I'm probably lowballing it just a smidgen, Uh, but I also wanted to keep it at roughly the calories of a Mountain House meal, which they range between 380 and 560 calories. They sell them all for the same price, at least at my Walmart. So, if you're going for a calorie to cost, basis, you get the one with the most calories, but, you want to diversify your meals as well. So, uh, the electrical cost that I came to, it's based off of what I pay, per kilowatt hour versus how long the machine ran, is there's roughly 62 cents worth of energy used for each bag. So 62 cents for the bag, 27 cents, uh, 62 cents for the energy, 27 cents for the bag, and oxygen absorber. And then the food wise, we're slightly under $2 a meal, at least for this specific meal. And so the way I look at that is, you're saving at the low end $8 a meal, and we made 8 meals. So that's $64 that didn't go into buying individual Mountain House meals. Um, we spent about $16 to do this whole process, which would buy you one to maybe 1.5 Mountain House meals. And we 8x'd the amount of food that was put away. Uh, the machine ran for about 36 hours and made 8 meals, roughly 4,000 calories worth. And the only other thing that I'm going to do is I've got a Plano, Foot Locker, hard plastic tote that I'm going to start filling up. It's in the closet right now. I don't want to pull it out. But in one of these videos, I'm gonna start showing off the amount of food that I'm putting away. That way we can kind of calculate, how close I'm getting to that 30 days of food supply. And, we're gonna run different things. I'm probably gonna do SpaghettiOs for 2 or 3 weekends. My son likes them. Everyone in the family eats them. It's a fairly, easy meal that all of us enjoy, which that's something that should go into this process is, you've probably heard it said a million times, eat what you prep and prep what you eat. I've never seen Mountain House freeze-dried SpaghettiOs. A friend of mine that does a lot of through hiking, she just did the JMT last year. She heard I had a freeze dryer and she's like, "Can you make me guacamole?" I've always thought about having guacamole when I'm hiking as like a, morale boost kind of thing. So we're going to figure out how to do that. We're going to freeze dry some guacamole. And that is the perfect example of, eating what you prep and prep what you eat. I'm not going to freeze dry, a veggie burger because I don't eat veggie burgers. I'll judge you a little bit, but if that's something that you eat, you freeze dry that, you put it up, and, you go for it. And this is helping, recoup the cost of, this sort of machine. We went halvesies with a friend of ours, and I need to hang out with him again so I can give him some money because he hasn't, been fully paid back for his half. But I also freeze dry food for him. So it's worked out. You can go with, we went with Harvest Right. They make a small, medium, large. They make a oil-free version, which is the one I recommend. They also have one that does have a, an oil type pump that needs to be changed out. The oil does. Um, but I would definitely go into this with multiple people. And, you just kind of set up a rotation. We're cooking, or we're freeze drying food for you, this week, food for me this week. We're putting this food at a bug out location. We're taking this stuff camping. Uh, all that stuff helps out. The last thing that I would say about, uh, freeze drying the food, because it's a very, very simple way to, just kind of put it back and forget about it. I would love to eat this in 20 years if I needed to. And, there's no telling, what this can of SpaghettiOs is going to cost in 20 years. Even if it's a $2 can of SpaghettiOs. The electrical and bag that went into this, I would still be saving myself about 35 cents. So it's also kind of a hedge against inflation. I don't know if I showed these off. These are replacement filters for the Berkey water system. I've bought 2 8-quart stainless steel pots and some hardware. And I bought a spigot off of Amazon because they didn't have the specific one that I wanted at my local hardware store. But I plan on making my own Berkey system because that is, the one downside for preparing your food this way is it is very, very water intensive. Yes, you could probably eat it the way that it is, but that would be miserable. The cats decided to have a little scuffle, and they knocked, the phone's charging, and they knocked it down. But, like I was saying, very, very water intensive. And so, you get super excited, even if you're running this thing 24/7, I did the math, and if every single weekend out of the year we did SpaghettiOs, we're looking at like 416 of these guys, which would be a very, substantial amount of food put away. But if you have one 5-gallon water container, you're going to run out of water storage before you run out of food to prepare that way. And that's not even including, I need to drink water, I need to, use water for hygiene, use it for everything else that we use water for. And so there's a little bit of a give and take. I, especially as a budget prepper, we make some freeze-dried meals. We buy a 5-gallon water storage. Freeze-dried meal, water storage. I've got the 65-gallon rain barrel that I don't have gutters at the moment. It's planned out on the list. I know everything that I want to buy to set it up. And that's where this guy comes in, because I can take the water from there, run it through here, and, I know I can drink that water. So have a plan, when you're buying emergency food, whatever, think of all of the pieces that go into this. You can pour just cold water in here, and it's going to reconstitute it, and it's going to basically turn it into an MRE without warming the meal up. It's highly recommended to use hot water. That way, we like to eat most of our food hot. It's kind of a comfort thing. And, it helps reconstitute it better. for a meal like this, I've used cold water to reconstitute fruits and things like that before, just because I think it tastes better. If you've ever eaten a warm strawberry, it's a very, very weird feeling, unless it's in something like oatmeal. But you know, that's this whole process. Uh, we're gonna pick up more SpaghettiOs for the coming weekend, so we can make 8 more of these. Uh, and probably at the end of that video, you'll see me filling up this container with this kind of food. Let me know in the comment section down below if there's a specific meal that you would like me to freeze dry. Do you want me to go through more of the freeze drying process? Uh, do you have any added tips or tricks? And, like, share, subscribe, comment, do all those sort of things. It helps the channel grow. It helps us reach more people. So, highly appreciate that. But until then, I'll catch you on the next one.